My name is Mateo. I'm going to tell you about a terrifying hunting adventure I had with my friend. In the highlands of Colorado, in the silent and cold embrace of the mountains, it had started to snow early. The snow was falling slowly, as if it were coming out of the mountains themselves and spreading across the ground. Cooper and I had set out on our annual black bear hunt. Cooper was a former soldier. Since returning from Vietnam, he had always had a look of strangeness in his eyes. It was as if his mind was still there, and he was lost somewhere. I was his close friend. I wanted to get away from the city and people and find some peace in nature. As we walked through the forest in the early morning, snowflakes hit our faces. I noticed that Cooper's hands were shaking. At first, I thought it was because of the cold, but it wasn't that cold. Maybe it was something else. Maybe it was a physical manifestation of the strangeness in his eyes. It could have been a trauma he experienced in Vietnam. Before I had a chance to think about it, suddenly, as if the earth had split open, a huge black bear appeared in front of us. I was so shocked that I couldn't breathe. My adrenaline rushed through my veins and my heart felt like it was about to jump out of my chest. Cooper raised his rifle and tried to aim at the bear, his hands shaking. His fingers hovered over the trigger, uncertain. The trembling in his hands made it difficult for him to aim. I stared at the bear in shock. Those terrifying eyes and huge claws were enough to terrify us. It looked as if it was about to devour us. Suddenly, Cooper pulled the trigger, and the bullet hit the bear's shoulder, but the animal was only wounded. The black bear let out a terrifying scream that pierced to the bone. It was so disturbing that it seemed to penetrate my soul. Then it disappeared into the depths of the forest, bleeding. "We have to follow it," Cooper said. But his voice didn't have that familiar tone of determination. There was a strange tremor in his voice. It was as if he was doubting himself. "We have to follow wounded animals so they don't suffer," he said. I agreed, and we started following the blood trail. We started walking deeper into the forest. The snow had intensified, turning into a curtain covering the sky. Every step we took disappeared without a trace. The wind blowing through the trees made disturbing noises. The blood trail appeared here and there on the branches and on the snow. I didn't know how far we had gone, but we must have covered quite a distance. We were starting to feel thirsty, and that's when we realized we had forgotten our bottles. Just then, a soft light began to filter through the trees. At first, I couldn't believe my eyes. It was strange to see light in such a desolate and deep forest. Curious, we moved toward it and saw a small cabin among the trees. It had wooden walls and yellow light was shining through the windows. Classical music was coming from inside, and seeing such a cabin in such a remote place was shocking. The contrast was so strange that I felt like we had accidentally stumbled into a fairy tale. Exhaustion and thirst had reached a point of no return, and we were forced to head toward the cabin door. I hesitated a bit before knocking, but we had no other choice. I knocked 3 times. From inside, we heard footsteps echoing on the wooden floor, growing closer. What kind of person would we encounter? We had no idea. We waited curiously, and now the door was slowly opening. The man who opened the door was about 45 years old, neatly dressed, and surprisingly polite. He had a sincere smile on his face. He seemed completely unsurprised by our arrival. "I'm Hudson," he said in a gentle voice. "Come in." We didn't want to turn down the invitation because we were in a difficult situation. It was cold outside, and we were thirsty. The cabin was much larger than it appeared from the outside. The shelves were lined with books, and classical music was playing. There was a strange but pleasant smell in the air. It was like a mixture of expensive perfume and old books. Hudson offered us coffee, and it was clear that he was a very cultured person. He talked about art, music, and literature, but I was more focused on his neck than on what he was saying. I could clearly see the tattoo on the man's neck. It was a complex octopus tattoo. One of the octopus's arms extended to the side of his neck. The tattoo looked familiar to me. I had seen it before, but I couldn't remember where. I racked my brain and suddenly remembered. The tattoo belonged to a serial killer who had been on the run for 10 years. It had been in the news, on TV. The man was called Hudson Hall. He had killed 7 people and was still at large. My body went cold. My heart began to race. I had to get Cooper somehow. Hudson was watching us constantly, and his smile never faded. It was as if he could hear everything, as if he knew everything. It seemed like he could sense my fear and was enjoying it. Hudson turned to the window and looked outside. "There's a storm coming," he said. Outside, a snowstorm had indeed begun. The wind had picked up and was howling against the windows. "Stay here until morning. There are plenty of beds," he said, but it sounded more like an order than an offer. His voice had changed and become harsh. There was something threatening beneath his polite mask. I glanced at Cooper, trying to tell him something with my eyes, but Cooper was oblivious, complaining only of his exhaustion. Hudson stood up and said, "I'll get the beds ready," and went into the back room. I took the opportunity to move closer to Cooper. "This man is a murderer," I whispered. I saw the tattoo on his neck. He's the man who killed 7 people 10 years ago. Cooper's eyes widened, and he looked at me in shock. I felt a cold shiver run through his body, and his face turned pale. We were both aware of the danger. When Hudson returned, he had that smile on his face again. It was as if he had heard our conversation. "Your room is ready," he said, but his voice was cold and determined. He turned to me and looked at my face. "You look worried. Is something wrong?" I replied in a trembling voice, "No, I'm just tired." That night it was impossible to sleep. Cooper and I were in the same room. I was shaking constantly and whispering, "We have to get out of here." But the storm outside was so fierce that it was impossible to leave. I felt like Hudson was watching us. It felt like he had eyes everywhere in the cabin. The fear was no longer just inside us. It had taken over our bodies. Around dawn, I heard a sound. It was as if someone was walking slowly in front of the door. I could hear footsteps. My heart began to race. Cooper had also heard the sound, and we both held our breath as we listened. The sounds were coming from the kitchen. Then metallic sounds began to emerge. It sounded like someone was sharpening a knife. We listened to these sounds all night and didn't sleep. In the morning, Hudson had prepared breakfast for us. I felt uneasy when I saw the knives on the table. Hudson was very comfortable using the knives. His hands seemed very skilled. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, but there was a mocking tone in his voice, and he knew we hadn't slept. Hudson's behavior started to get weirder. He changed the way he treated us and wasn't acting like we were guests anymore. It was like we were prisoners here. "The weather's bad today. It'd be better for you to stay another day," he said, and it sounded like an order to me. The guy was blocking our escape route. Cooper and I made eye contact, and we were both thinking the same thing. We had to escape, but we didn't know how. Hudson was constantly watching us. Outside, the snowstorm was still raging, and he had our gun. He had taken Cooper's rifle for safety reasons, but his real motive was clear. When Hudson went outside to get wood at noon, we quickly went to the back room. Cooper and I were quietly searching for something. We found things in the room that made us shiver. There were blood-stained clothes, rusty cutting tools, and photos of victims with their eyes gouged out, lined up on the wall. The scene was so disturbing that I felt like I was going to vomit. By the time we realized Hudson had noticed us, it was too late. He was standing at the door with a large knife in his hand. The fake politeness was gone from his eyes. There was only cold anger and madness. "Curious cats die young," he said, and laughed. There was no way to escape, but Hudson had locked the door. I looked at the windows, but they were small. It would be difficult to escape from there. The only way out was to get past Hudson. Cooper looked at me, both of us trembling with fear. If we wanted to survive, we had to do something. Hudson was slowly approaching us. At that moment, as Hudson was walking toward us, I grabbed a lantern and threw it at him. The oil from the lamp splashed onto Hudson's face, and he screamed in terror and backed away. Cooper grabbed the large vase on the table and hit Hudson on the head with it. Hudson stumbled and fell to the ground, but he still had the knife in his hand. We ran to the door and tried to open it, but it was locked. Hudson must have locked it from the inside. "Where's the key?" I shouted. Hudson was groaning on the floor but trying to get up. Blood was flowing from his forehead, but his eyes were still staring at us with that terrifying glint. "We have to find the key," he said. Cooper started searching Hudson's pockets. Hudson suddenly grabbed Cooper's leg and stabbed him with the knife. Cooper screamed in pain. I started kicking Hudson. "Let him go!" I shouted. Hudson let go of Cooper but was trying to get up. Blood was flowing from Cooper's leg. "We'll get out the window," I said, but the windows were really small. We had no other choice. I grabbed the chair to break the glass. Hudson stood up, his face covered in blood, and said, "You can't escape." He started walking toward us. I hit the window with the chair and the glass shattered. Cold air and snowflakes poured in. Cooper was injured and had trouble moving. I had to help him. Hudson had a knife in his hand and was getting closer. "Don't worry, we'll both get out," I said, and grabbed Cooper's arm. I pulled him toward the window. The glass shards were cutting my hands, but I didn't care. I just wanted to escape. I pushed Cooper out the window and threw him out. I jumped out after him and started running away. A snowstorm greeted us outside. Hudson was yelling after us. "You can't escape me, I'll find you," he said. His voice was so terrifying that my hair stood on end. Cooper's leg was hurting, but we kept running. The snowstorm was hitting our faces. We didn't dare look back. We didn't know if Hudson was following us. We ran until we couldn't breathe. The cold was penetrating our bones, but we didn't stop. We thought Hudson would appear behind us at any moment. After running for hours, we finally found a road. We went to town and told the police everything. They went to look for Hudson's cabin, but no one was there. It was as if no one had ever lived there. They only found the blood-stained room and the photographs. Hudson Hall had disappeared again, as if it had never existed. I still think about that night. Hudson's octopus tattoo on his neck and the wounded bear's scream. It was as if everything had started with that wounded bear's scream. Maybe everything starts with a hunt and ends with another hunt. because Hudson is still out there, somewhere, waiting for his new victims, his new storms.
Montana Northern Mountains, December 15, 2018, Saturday.
I am Russel, 54 years old, and I worked as a park ranger in these mountains for 30 years. After retiring, I did not leave these mountains. I continued to live alone, miles away from civilization, because these mountains are my home, my everything. They are like the air I breathe. But that night I realized that nature does not belong to us, that we are merely temporary guests. My nephew, Cody, is my brother Jake's son. He is only 20 years old. With the artificial courage of a city boy, he explored the area as if it were a camping adventure. But in the corner of his eye, I saw that spark he hadn't yet dared to call courage. He wanted to know the true cruelty of nature. On the evening of December 14th, as we sat around the fire in front of my cabin, he said to me, "Uncle, my dad always tells me your stories. I want to learn how you survived in these mountains and how you dealt with the wild animals." The sincerity in his voice touched me. He was eager and excited. The next day, December 15th, we woke up at exactly 6:30 a.m. to a terrible snowstorm outside. Snowflakes were sticking to the window. The wind was howling and beating against the wooden walls of the cabin. When Cody woke up that morning, his first words were, "What's that noise, Uncle?" There was a hint of worry in his voice, but no real fear yet. He didn't yet understand what a Montana winter meant. As I sipped my coffee and looked out the window, I remembered the phone call from Tom Peterson the night before. My farmer neighbor had called me and said,
"Russell, those coyotes are crazy. They attacked my sheep last night and we lost 3. You'd better keep an eye out."
There was both anger and fear in his voice. Tom had been farming in this area for over 30 years and had never seen coyotes so aggressive. Tom was worried and had asked me for help. "Cody, today I can teach you a real lesson," I said to my nephew. He was watching the snowstorm outside with a cup of hot coffee in his hands. "We're going to find the pack of coyotes that's been attacking the farm animals, and you're going to learn how to deal with them. But remember, this isn't a game, it's a fight for survival." I saw a moment of fear in Cody's eyes, but his eyes were shining. There was a fire of youth within him. "I'm ready, Uncle. What will you teach me?" he said. The determination in his voice both proud and worried me, because youthful courage often can't hear the voice of danger. At 8:15 a.m. we prepared our rifles, ammunition, first aid kit, and food. The temperature outside was minus 18 degrees, and it was snowing heavily. But I wasn't worried because I knew these mountains well, or at least I thought I shouldn't be worried. Cody asked, "Uncle, isn't it dangerous to go out in this weather?" He tried to hide the worry in his voice, but I could tell he was scared. Coyotes get hungrier and more dangerous in this weather, but we have to stop them. They could damage property and attack other people, I said. But I also knew how risky it was to go out in such bad weather. I wanted to teach him to be brave. We started walking toward the Peterson farm at 9:30 a.m., and the snow was falling so heavily that our footprints were disappearing within minutes. Cody kept looking back and asking, "Uncle, will we be able to find our way home?" His voice grew more anxious, and I tried to reassure him, "Don't worry. I've known these mountains for 30 years." But I had a strange feeling inside. It felt like this time, things would be different. When we arrived at the Peterson farm, it was 10:45 a.m., and Tom met us at the gate. His face was pale, and there was a deep fear in his eyes. "Russell, I'm glad you're here. They attacked again last night. This time, we lost 5 sheep. Something caught my attention. The coyotes weren't afraid of me at all. I tried to chase them away, but they didn't run. They just stared at us with their red eyes," he said. The worry in his voice made me uneasy. Tom was a brave man, and I was surprised to see him so frightened. We went to the place where the coyotes had attacked. The paw prints, bloodstains, and torn remains of sheep sticking out of the snow looked terrifying. "This isn't normal, Uncle. Coyotes can't be this vicious, can they?" he asked. He was clearly scared. I had to tell him the truth. "No, Cody, this isn't normal. They seem to have gone mad. They're probably very hungry or sick. They could be even more dangerous in that condition." We started to follow the tracks. We guessed that the coyotes had headed north toward the forest. That area was one of the most desolate and dangerous places in Montana. It was full of dense pine forests, deep valleys, and cliffs. It was very easy to get lost in that forest. At 12:30, half an hour after entering the forest, we heard the first coyote sounds, and the sound was so strange and disturbing that Cody began to get scared. "Uncle, that doesn't sound normal to me. They sound like they're in pain," he said. And indeed, these howls were very different from the normal sounds of coyotes. The sounds were very intense, and they were howling longer. It was a very frightening sound. "Be quiet and follow me," I said. But I felt a similar anxiety inside myself because in my 30 years of experience, I had rarely heard such sounds. At 1:15 p.m., as we stood on a snowy hill looking down, we saw a pack of about 15 coyotes in the middle of the valley, and the scene was truly frightening. The coyotes had formed a circle around a dead deer. Some coyotes were eating the deer's flesh, while others were looking around and making those strange howling sounds. I wanted to get a closer look at them. We began to descend quietly. The snow was so deep that we sank up to our knees with every step. We were panting, but the coyotes could hear us breathing. When we were about 100 meters away, I stopped and told Cody my plan. "We'll shoot them from here. You take the 3 on the right and I'll take the ones on the left," I said. But just then, something terrible happened. All the coyotes turned toward us and their eyes were really red. I was overcome with excitement and fear, but I had to move fast. I held my breath and took aim. I fired my first shot and hit a coyote. But the others didn't run away. On the contrary, they started running towards us. At that moment, I realized we had made a terrible mistake. These coyotes were not normal coyotes. They were much more aggressive, much bolder, and much more dangerous. "Run, Cody, run!" I shouted. We both started running towards the hill. We were trying to escape quickly, terrified by the sound of the coyotes behind us. But the snow was so deep that it was very difficult to run. We kept falling, getting up, and trying to run again. As we ran, Cody shouted, "Uncle, how many are there?" He was out of breath, and the panic in his voice was becoming uncontrollable. I replied, "I don't know, but there are a lot," because the sounds behind us were getting louder and louder. It was as if 30 or 40 coyotes were running toward us. It was a strange and inexplicable situation. While we were running, Cody suddenly cried out, "Ah!" and fell to the ground. He had injured his foot on a tree stump. "I can't get up, Uncle. My foot hurts so much," he said, tears streaming down his face. At that moment, when I heard the coyotes getting closer behind us, I looked around in panic and, by chance, saw an old hunter's cabin about 200 meters ahead. It looked a little old. The roof was broken and the walls were cracked, but it could still be a shelter. "Cody, get on my back. We have to hold on until we get to that cabin," I said, and picked up my nephew. At that moment, the coyotes continued to howl. With great difficulty, we reached the cabin and I immediately closed the door. But the door didn't seem very sturdy. I looked around and had to pile old wooden tables and chairs in front of the door. Cody was sitting in the corner of the cabin, holding his leg. "Uncle, can we get out of here? Will they find us?" he asked. And his fear was contagious because our situation was really bad. It was 2:45 p.m. when the first coyote sounds began to come from around the cabin, and these sounds were so terrifying, so disturbing, that when they mixed with the smell of rotten wood inside the cabin, it created a nightmarish atmosphere. "Calm down, Cody. I have my rifle. I have ammunition. We can hold out until morning," I said. But even my own voice betrayed my uncertainty, because the coyote sounds were growing louder and louder. It was as if all the coyotes in the forest had gathered here. When I dared to look out the window, the sight shocked me. There were at least 30 coyotes surrounding the cabin, all staring at us. They were all focused on us. I could almost hear the coyotes breathing inside the cabin. It was as if they were waiting patiently for us to make a mistake. "Cody, don't look out the window. Just sit down and be quiet," I said. I didn't want him to see this scene. He was already scared enough. At 5:30 p.m., as the sun was setting, the coyotes became even more aggressive. They were clawing at the door of the cabin, trying to tear the old wood apart. When Cody asked, "Uncle, what do they want from us?" I couldn't tell him the truth. Coyotes normally run away from people, but these were different. We had become the coyotes' prey. At 8 p.m., we began to hear the coyotes clawing at the rotten boards on the roof of the cabin. "Can they get in from above, Uncle?" he asked. "No, they can't get up there," I said, but I wasn't sure. These coyotes were capable of anything outside their normal behavior. Towards midnight, at 11:45 p.m., the coyotes suddenly fell silent. There was no sound coming from outside the cabin. This silence made me uneasy and thoughtful. "Are they gone?" whispered Cody, but I told him, "No, they're still there, just planning something different." And that was indeed the case, because I could hear the coyotes' footsteps. It was as if they were circling us. It was 2:30 a.m. Our eyelids were slowly closing. We were sleepy and tired. A very strange, very disturbing sound came from the back wall of the cabin. It sounded like coyotes digging, trying to get in through the ground. This possibility scared me so much that I immediately got my rifle ready. "Cody, stay awake. I think they're trying to get in from the back," I said, and my nephew opened his eyes wide and looked at me with a terrified expression. Towards morning, at 5 a.m., when the first light of dawn appeared, the coyote sounds gradually began to fade, and by 6:30 a.m., we couldn't hear anything anymore. It was as if they had all left. I watched outside the window for a while and saw no movement, but there were dozens of coyote footprints in the snow around the cabin. This was proof of what we had experienced. "Uncle, are we safe now?" Cody asked. His voice was still trembling, and there was deep fear in his eyes. Yes, we're safe. I think they're all gone, but we'll never come back to the depths of this forest again, I said. At 8 a.m., as we were driving home, Cody asked me, "Uncle, were those coyotes normal? Have you ever seen anything like that before?" I told him the truth. "No, Cody, I've never seen anything like that in 30 years. What we experienced last night was very strange and very frightening. I hope we never encounter such a situation again." After that day, Cody was never the same. There was a constant fear in his eyes, and 2 days later, on our way back to Billings, he said, "Uncle, I will never forget what we experienced tonight. I learned how dangerous Montana can be. I still live here in these mountains, but I have never gone deep into the woods since that night. Because sometimes at night when the wind blows, I think I hear the terrible howling of coyotes in the distance, and then I relive that night."
Wisconsin, Chequamegon Forest, October 15, 2024, Monday.
My name is David. You can't see how my hands are shaking as I write this story, but believe me, my fingers are trembling just like they did on that terrifying day, and I have to force myself to write every word. Because after that terrible incident in the Wisconsin woods, my state of mind has never been the same. Since that terrifying night in the wild forest, my soul feels like it has fallen into a dark pit. Especially the dreams I have at night and the strange sounds I hear. I can no longer sleep peacefully at night like I used to. It was a Monday. My son Ryan, my coworker Sam, and I had gone hunting. That Monday morning, at exactly 5:30 a.m., I woke up in the Chequamegon Forest in Wisconsin, 35 miles north of the town of Park Falls, and there was a strange silence outside my tent. That unsettling silence made me nervous. The forest shouldn't have been that quiet. Normally, we would hear birds chirping, leaves rustling in the wind, and the footsteps of small animals running around. But that morning, it was as if the entire forest had held its breath. I could hear Ryan snoring from his tent and strange murmurs coming from Sam's tent. It sounded like he was fighting or arguing with someone in his dream, but I couldn't make out any words. Only a deep, disturbing hum was coming from the tent. "David, wake up." I woke up to the sound of Sam's voice echoing from outside the tent. The determined and chilling tone of Sam's voice always made my heart race. He always spoke as if danger was about to descend upon us at any moment. It reminded me of those terrifying nights we spent patrolling the streets of Detroit. Sam called out to us again. "Breakfast is ready. It's going to be a good day for hunting." When I stepped out of my tent, it was 6:15 a.m. The sun had not yet risen, but when I looked to the east, the sky was lit up with a pinkish glow. Sam was crouched by the campfire making coffee, and Ryan was meticulously cleaning his rifle, polishing it carefully as if it were a sacred relic. But I had a strange feeling inside me. It was as if something was going to go wrong, but I didn't know why. Maybe it had something to do with the terrible dream I had had the night before. Ryan asked, "Dad, did you hear any strange noises last night?" I could hear the childish anxiety in his voice. It sounded like someone was walking around the tents. "No, son, I didn't hear anything," I said, but it was a lie because I had heard the noises too. In fact, when I heard the sounds, I had even considered going outside to take a look, but I couldn't muster the courage. I had assumed it was a small animal, probably a raccoon or an opossum. Sam looked at us, sipping his coffee. and I saw that old detective look in his eyes. The boy is right, David. I heard it too. But it wasn't a large animal. It sounded like human footsteps. After Sam said that, I felt a chill run down my spine. Being here, deep in the woods, 20 miles from the nearest settlement with other people around was quite unsettling, and that bad feeling inside me was growing. Was someone watching us? We ate breakfast in silence and started getting ready for the hunt at 7:30 a.m. because white-tailed deer are usually more active at dawn and dusk. These hours were ideal for hunting, but that morning everything felt different to me. The forest was making me feel uneasy. As Ryan slung his rifle over his shoulder, he asked, "Which way should we go?" I hesitated for a moment, feeling that the direction we took was very important. "Let's go north," I said, "to the area where I saw tracks last night." But in reality, I hadn't seen any tracks last night. I had only imagined that terrifying place from my dream and given that answer. We left the camp at 8 a.m. and started walking north. The sound of leaves crunching under our feet broke the strange silence of the forest, and with every step I felt like someone was watching us. There was a terrible weight on my shoulders, and I kept wanting to turn around and look behind me. I was looking around more carefully than usual. Ryan asked, "Dad, are you okay? Your face looks really pale." "I'm fine, son, just," I started to say but couldn't finish because at that moment I saw movement in the direction Ryan was pointing. About 200 yards away, a brown shadow was moving among the trees, and my heart began to race. Sam whispered, "Deer!" He immediately crouched down and readied his rifle. It's a big buck with magnificent antlers. I raised my rifle and looked through the scope and saw that the brown shadow was indeed a large white-tailed deer. Its antlers glistened in the sunlight, and the animal grazed calmly, seemingly unaware of our presence. "I'll shoot," I said, feeling that old police authority in my voice. "Don't move." Looking through my binoculars, I saw the deer raise its head and look in our direction. Its eyes glowed menacingly. The deer was right in my sights. I took a deep breath, braced myself, and pulled the trigger. I heard the gunshot echo through the forest, and at the same time I saw the brown shadow stumble. But then I was confronted with the shocking reality. What I had shot wasn't a deer, it was a man. Sam shouted, "Damn it!" and started running. "David, you shot a man!" I froze for a moment. My eyes were fixed on the void, overwhelmed by the shock of the horrific thoughts racing through my mind. The fear I felt was indescribable. As those terrible words echoed in my ears, my legs gave out and I collapsed to the ground. The rifle fell from my hands, and that horrific night in Detroit when I shot that boy came back to me in vivid detail. My hands were shaking and I couldn't breathe. Ryan ran over to me, shouting, "Dad!" He grabbed my shoulders and shook me, his eyes filled with fear. "Dad, calm down. Maybe you just wounded him." I could hear the wounded man's voice. The distant cries and moans worried me, echoing through the forest. The bad feeling inside me grew stronger because the voice didn't sound like a normal human voice. It was more like the sound of a wild animal. Just then, Sam's voice rang out, "Here! He's wounded but alive." I ran over and was met with a horrific sight. A tall man with dirty hair and torn clothes was lying on the ground. Blood was flowing from his shoulder, and his eyes were glowing strangely. His eyes and gaze were not normal. Ryan asked in a frightened voice, "Who is this man? What is he doing here?" I don't know, I said, but at that moment I noticed something about the man's face. He had a look of fear on his face, but he seemed to recognize us and look as if he had been waiting for us. We need to call an ambulance. Sam checked his phone. There's no signal here. We need to take him to the camp. When we lifted the injured man, I noticed how light he was. It was as if he was nothing but bones and skin. A terrible smell hit my nose. It wasn't just the smell of blood, it was the smell of rotting flesh. It made me feel sick. The man mumbled, "Help me." His voice sounded so strange, as if he hadn't spoken in a very long time. Then he mumbled again, "They're coming." Sam furrowed his brow. "Who's coming?" The man's eyes closed, but his lips were still moving. We returned to camp at 9:30 a.m. and laid him down inside my tent. I cleaned his wound and bandaged it, but that awful smell still lingered in my nose. Even though the man was unconscious, his lips kept moving. It was as if he was talking to someone invisible. "Ryan, Dad, this man looks very familiar to me. I feel like I've seen him somewhere before." "Where do you know him from?" I asked. But then I saw the man's eyes open and look at us. The look in his eyes was terrifying. But it was as if this man could see into the depths of our souls. The man began to speak in a whisper. "You don't know this place. This is our territory." His voice was so frightening that the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Sam spoke harshly. "Our territory? Who are you?" I saw Sam's hand move toward his gun as he spoke, but the man closed his eyes again and didn't answer. He just made broken murmurs with his lips, and I knew then that something terrible was about to happen. That night, October 15th, we experienced terrifying things. Around 11 p.m., I started hearing those unsettling sounds outside my tent. Footsteps and whispers were reaching my ears. It sounded like several people were moving around the tents, but they were being very quiet. It was as if they were trying not to wake us up. Sam spoke in a low voice. "David, there's someone outside." I grabbed my gun, unlocked the safety, and went outside. The scene in front of me was terrifying. The sight I saw made my breath catch in my throat. Around the camp, among the trees, there were at least 6 or 7 dark shadows, and they were all staring at us. Their eyes glowed strangely, like the wounded man's. "Who are you?" I shouted, but none of them answered. I could only hear those terrifying whispers, and it sounded like they were talking to each other, but I couldn't make out the words. "Dad!" Ryan jumped out of the tent, and at that moment I realized the terrifying truth. My tent was empty, and the wounded man had vanished. There were only bloodstains on the ground, and that awful smell still lingered. Sam asked in fear, "Where is he?" My eyes were fixed on those dark shadows because they were approaching us, and I could see what they were. They looked like humans but were different. Tattered clothes, long hair, dirty faces, and those terrifying eyes. One of them spoke. His voice was hollow and cold, like a deep well. "This is our territory." His voice was strange. It sounded like he had just learned to speak. "You are not welcome here," he said. My veins turned to ice. "We only came here to hunt." "We don't want to hurt anyone," I replied, my voice trembling with fear. Another one spoke. "You hurt us," he said, turning his head to the side. When I looked in the direction he pointed, I saw the wounded man standing among them. His shoulder was still bleeding, but he was able to stand. With a terrible smile on his face, he said, "Now you owe us." Sam approached me and whispered, David, where are our guns?" I turned back to the tent, but at that moment I was confronted with a shocking reality. Our rifles were inside the tent, but the dark figures had already surrounded the tents. We couldn't get our weapons. All we had was my pistol, and it would be useless against them. "Run!" I shouted, and at the same moment we heard that terrifying sound. All those men were shouting at once, but their voices weren't human. They sounded like wolves howling and wild animals roaring. Filled with fear and adrenaline, we started running. We could hear those terrifying sounds behind us. Footsteps and screams were coming from the darkness. It was as if a pack of wild animals was chasing us, but I knew they were humans. They were people who had lived in the forest for a long time and had become wild. Sam shouted, "This way!" and we turned left. But then I realized the terrible truth. They knew the forest better than we did. No matter which way we went, they would catch us. Because we had only been here for 3 days, but who knows how many years they had been here. Ryan was out of breath, and we had to stop. We hid behind a large tree and listened to those terrifying sounds, footsteps and whispers all around us. They were searching for us but hadn't found us yet. They didn't know where we were. Ryan asked me in a voice filled with fear, "Dad, who are they?" "I don't know, son," I said, but I had my guess. They were people who lived deep in the forest, cut off from civilization, perhaps hiding here for years, living by their own dark laws. Maybe they were hunters hunting other hunters. I told Ryan to stay quiet. That terrifying night went on like that until morning, and we stayed hidden behind that big tree. The hours and minutes passed as we trembled, trying to breathe quietly, listening to those disturbing sounds. They roamed around us all night searching for us, but they couldn't find us. It was now the morning of October 16th. At 6 a.m., with the first rays of sunlight, silence returned, and we gathered our courage and decided to come out from behind the tree. We looked around but couldn't see anyone. There were only footprints on the ground. There were so many that it looked like an army had passed through. Sam said, "We have to go back to camp." But there was hesitation in his voice because we didn't know if the camp was safe. We had many questions in our minds, but we had to go. When we returned to the camp, it was 6:30 a.m. We were met with a shocking sight. Our tents were torn, our belongings were scattered, and our rifles were gone. Only the canned food was left, but they had been opened, as if someone had eaten them with their fingers. It seemed that someone had come here looking for us. "Get in the car. We're going to the car right now," I said. We rushed to the car, but it wasn't where we had parked it. There were only tire tracks on the ground, and I realized with horror that they had left us stranded in the forest. The nearest road was 20 miles away, and all we had was my pistol. Ryan asked, "What are we going to do?" "We'll walk," I said. "We'll walk to the road." We were tired and sleepy, but we had no choice. That terrifying walk began, and we started walking south. With every step, I felt that awful feeling. It was as if they were watching us, as if they were going to attack at any moment. After walking for a while, we tried to rest at noon when we heard that terrible sound. It was a scream coming from far away. It was a human voice, but it was so terrifying that our hair stood on end. Sam said, "They're coming," and we started running. Right now, I'm writing the final lines of this story at home. Don't worry, I'm safe now, but nothing is the same after that terrifying night. I can tell you this. The things that live in the depths of that forest are still there, still waiting for their prey, still playing that terrifying game.